Okay, how is your memory? You have good memories, bad memories, mediocre memories. How is your memory? This is a section I want to talk about memory. I'm going to start out by talking about the 5 steps of the memory process. And the first step is intention, to have the want, the desire to remember. You are much more likely to remember something if you want to remember it. Everybody's probably had the experience where somebody comes up to them, in a public place, in a bar, whatever it is, and introduces themselves. Hi, my name is Bruce. And you have no intention of ever talking to this person again. And so that name goes in one ear and out the other ear, and a second and a half later you have no idea who you're talking to. And we can, of course, remember stuff that we had no intention of remembering, and there's probably lots of stuff in your past that you would just as soon forget. This type of, when we talk about this memory process, is stuff that you probably should remember. For example, material from class. So the first step in the memory process is actually having the intention to remember. And then the second step is to observe it. In order to remember it, you got to get it in the brain in some fashion. You have to see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, smell it, get it in there, however that is, to observe the information. And then that brings us to organization. Let me move my little picture. To organize the material. Some part of organization is actually giving it a name, because we're more likely to remember something if we have a name for it. But it's also to quite literally organize the material. A lot of your life is organized. You remember people. I remember this person from 3rd grade and this person from 6th grade. This is somebody I know from work. This is somebody I know from school. So a lot of that process just happens naturally. This part of organization is actually to kind of force that process along. And the next step of the memory process is retention. It's the part of the memory process that you hold that memory in your brain. You keep it in there to retain, to store, to keep that memory in your brain. And the final step is to recall it, to get it back out of your brain. This is the part of the memory process that you're actually tested over. If come time for the exam, if you can't recall that information, then you don't remember that information. These are the 5 steps of the memory process: intention, observation, organization, retention, and recall. Do you like Winnie the Pooh? You see, I like Winnie the Pooh. My favorite character on Winnie the Pooh is Eeyore. Eeyore is just kind of always forgetting where he left his tail. And so he makes a pretty good device for remembering this. If you spell it Eeyore this way, and I know this isn't how Eeyore spells his name, but it's an acronym. An acronym is a mnemonic device. I'm going to talk about those in just a second. An acronym is where you take the first letter of a series of words and you make another word out of it. In this case, Eeyore, which stands for intention, observation, organization, my picture again, retention, and recall. Eeyore, the 5 steps of the memory process. So when it comes time to recall this information, if you can visualize my pictures here on the screen, and you can remember that Eeyore is spelled I-O-O-R-R, then you have an acronym and you have a visual representation of the 5 steps of the memory process. Now some memory strategies, some things to do to help you remember. Strategy number 1, quite simply, use all of your senses. Make your learning visual, make your learning auditory, make your learning kinesthetic. The more senses you memorize something with, the greater chance to recall that information. If you only remembered something visually, you have to recall it visually. If you only remember something auditorily, you have to recall it auditorily. So the more of these you bring in, the more likely you are to remember something. Another memory strategy is quite simply to write information down, otherwise take notes. But you got to be careful here because this one has a double-edged sword to it. It depends on the intent in which you're taking notes. If you take notes with the intent that the notes are going to help you remember, then those notes will help you remember. But if you're taking notes so that you won't have to remember, then those notes will actually hurt your memory. Now there's a scene in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Sean Connery, Harrison Ford. Indiana Jones asks his father some question, and his father responds, "I don't remember." And Indiana Jones responds, "Well, you should remember, you wrote it in your journal." And his father responds, "I wrote it in my journal so I wouldn't have to remember." If you're taking notes so that those notes will help you remember, those notes will help you remember. But if you're taking notes with the intent that you don't have to remember because now that information is written down, then those notes will actually hurt your memory. Working in short sessions, it takes time for our brain to process the information. When you are learning new information, your brain is actually growing, changing, it's developing. Little axons and dendrites and neurons are moving around up here, and it takes time for that to happen. I know that I can only keep my concentration for 20 to 30 minutes. I have no idea what it is. For you it might be 5 or 10 minutes, for you it might be 40 or 50 minutes. I don't know. Biologically, we need to take a break about every hour because it takes time for these nerves to grow into our brain, to really change. You're changing physically when you're learning new material. And integrate your left and right sides of your brains. You have two brains, so use both sides of the brains. Make your notes more right brain. Almost all of the information that comes to you in college is going to come to your left brain. It's up to you to make your notes more right brain. That's why I put those images on the first slide for the 5 steps of the memory process, is because your right brain looks at that and goes, oh, I get it. Your left brain goes, huh? I don't know. So integrate. Make your notes both left and right brain. To organize your information. One of the easiest ways when you're taking notes to organize your information is to leave gaps in there. That every time the subject changes, you leave this gap. If you can, put headings and topics on there so that you're organizing the information as you're learning. Create some organizational strategy for your information. And make associations. One of the most powerful memory devices is to associate something you're learning with something you already know. When we get into mnemonic devices, I'm going to talk about this more specifically. Or every time you're in class and you go, oh, that reminds me of a time when, you're made an association. In reading strategies, we call this make connections. Rote memory is actually how most people memorize things. Rote is when you say something over and over and over and over until you finally get it. For those of you who are taking medical terminology class, you'll probably create these little 3x5 flashcards, word on one side, definition on the other side, and you'll just go through it over and over and over until you finally get it for our memory strategies. Next, I'll be talking about mnemonic devices in our next video.